Hello. If it's Friday, it's the CEO series. Our guest today is Steve Schloss, CHRO, United States Golf Association, founder and principal of Listen Forward. Steve is an accomplished chief people officer, forward-thinking leader, coach, advisor, mentor, teacher, and one of my best buddies. For over 3 decades, he's built, scaled, evolved, and transformed capability and culture at premier organizations, established high-growth organizations across nonprofit, services, and support, from the Golf Association to technology to digital media, publishing, and financial services. I think you covered it all. Steve, welcome as a guest today.
Hey, Ron. Hi, everybody. It is great to be here on a Friday spring day, and looking forward to catching up and engaging in a good conversation.
Good. Very, very, very honored to have you here. You know, I was just saying before we went live how, and I want to tell this to the audience, Steve and I go way back, and every Christmas holiday, we spend a 2-hour lunch, 3-hour lunch. We sit and talk and we cover everything until we've talked out. And now we're going to bring this on live for an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. We're going to try and condense it in that period of time. So Steve, talk to us as a CHRO for a well-renowned global organization, as well as an advisor to venture capitalists. What are some insights that you are observing in the space today from that HR perspective as well as business perspective?
That's a great question. On the surface, working with a 126-year-old sports organization, USGA, while also advising a 35-year-old venture firm that is investing in young companies, on the surface, it would seem quite different. And in some ways, it definitely is. But in reality, the topics of CEO and executive team performance while leading through uncertainty, building and scaling capability, creating a culture of impact, winning and making a difference, they transcend all these organizations. Yeah. And so there are some really wonderful entrepreneurs who have made a huge difference, and I've experienced that, and also some really committed people inside the sport that I'm a part of that are also doing the same thing. But I would say, I thinking about this question, the one thing that comes to mind, having worked in a fast-growing tech company and now a sports organization that is historic, and then also doing this advising on the side, is that there's a huge difference when it comes to what it means to learn how to get things done and be adaptable. And more specifically, when you're working in a larger organization and you can depend upon people to draw from or work with internally, in a smaller organization, as you can imagine, the distance between you and getting something done is very short, and it really falls on you. And so oftentimes all the confidence that people have inside a big organization comes up against whether or not the competence they have to get it done in a smaller organization. And that's one of the things you can see very clearly.
Mm-hmm. So from that so-called CHRO to more of an advisor. So the topic was CHRO advisor and the role it plays in organizational performance. But the advisory piece carries a lot of weight because you're looked upon as a business advisor through the lens of people, and your context is from that vantage point. Can you give us a little insight around that, making that transition from HR to business advisor?
Well, I would say that when you're advising an organization, part of this comes down to helping a CEO and executive team determine how they can perform more effectively individually and together. And in doing so, that's no different than being the chief HR officer of an organization. How can you create value and help them help themselves be more effective? At the same time is, how do you help them think about the importance of culture and capability, and to be able to scale both in parallel, particularly in the context of how we're all operating right now in spaces of uncertainty. And so being an advisor to them and tapping into the 30, 35 years worth of experience now to have seen so many different business scenarios, and being a modern thinker today, I'm trying to bring to them some context and perspective that I think could be valued for them. And what I bring is a lot of experience and stories and skill sets, because I've worked across so many different industries, that I think is helpful to them, because there are so many ways to transform in different environments, and to bring that forward into a new and different environment.
Okay. So that equal, sitting in that boardroom, sitting in that C-level meeting, I'm seen as an equal versus, and I'm going to say this, and you know what I mean when I say this, as the HR person.
Oh, completely.
Yeah. So how were you able to make that transition? One of the things I always tell people, I did a session this morning out of Singapore, and I said, always try and be seen as the business person and let the HR tag into that. That's your specialty. That's my views. Go ahead.
Yeah. Listen, I grew up, just in context, my father started a couple of businesses, ran his businesses, and I grew up with the perspective, what does it take to run a business? So the fact that I'm a chief HR officer, I've always thought of myself as a business leader. And actually, as I grew up in my career, sometimes I got my hand slapped, or I got pushed back because I was getting out of my lane. And, there's a couple of examples where I might have told the CEO more than what they wanted to hear. And I was kind of unapologetic about it, because I was pretty confident that, and I felt I had the reasons to do so, to engage. And I think for a lot of leaders, that was not what they would like out of my role, the way they perceived it.
Mm-hmm. Well, a key point you mentioned, it out of my role, because if that was the CMO or the CIO would have come in and made that statement or that observation, it would probably have been taken differently.
Probably so. I think the world has changed where that is likely less so, but I'm not so sure that's fully been achieved yet. So
yeah, okay. So you when you look across the landscape, when I was reading through your background, and I saw the Time Inc., I think we may have connected between Time and LivePerson somewhere around there. Yeah. So let's see: banking, publishing, digital, nonprofit, sports. There's nothing else you can cover. So what was the major learning from all of those? When you sit around and think about where you are today, what did you pull away from that, as well as your father starting a business and understanding from that vantage point?
It's interesting. One thing that you left out there, which I think was also a great learning experience, was that early in my career, I'm going to say at about age 25, I got fired from a job that I had sold myself really well into a very cool software company. And 3 weeks into the job, they realized and I realized I was way out of my league. And I sold myself really well. And I guess my confidence was far greater than my competence at that point. But what I would say is it taught me something that each experience, you have to learn what it means to take risk and one that fits your definition of risk. And so that taught me very quickly that the importance of risk taking and the acceptance of what comes with it. Advocating for yourself based on your accomplishments, not just for the sake of doing so. Being a strategic and tactical person in a way that you both know how to get things done and help explain why, but also how to work through others. And your ability to develop great relationships make a huge difference across all those experiences. But I would say the one thing that's helped me, given the very different kinds of worlds that I've worked in, is how I've learned to unlearn the things that might have been valuable to me in the past experiences and be able to turn that into a space where I have to learn new skills, but bring what I thought might be most valuable forward at the same time. So there's kind of a learning and unlearning process that you have to go through. And that's the one thing I think that has enabled me quite a bit through this whole journey.
Okay. The term you use, unlearn. Think about, how did that fail? Why did that fail? What can I do better next time? It was kind of cool for you to admit that I oversold myself. And that comes with really looking inside and said, it wasn't their issue. It was my issue because I wasn't prepared for the role.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, when they offered me the job, they offered me more money than I was even looking for. And I knew right away, I got it in the pit of my stomach. I said, something's wrong here. And I might have done something, not even realizing it. But you know what? It was such a great experience when I reflect on it, because it both validated something that I knew, but it also taught me something that I didn't know. And it was a great experience. And, it's easy to look back on it and see it that way, but at the time it was not particularly fun. But I'm glad I went through it.
Yeah, well, in the moment it never is, but I'm going to say it's reflection, looking back and saying, honest assessment as to what happened. Why did that not work? And I think my thought is that people today, in trying to build careers or whatever it is that you're going after, don't spend enough time thinking back and saying, how can I? It's kind of like building blocks. Do you see it that way? Building blocks, because you've gone through so many industries here.
Yeah, it's a great question. I look at all the things that I've done as accumulated experiences that have certainly taught me things, each one of them building on themselves. I'll give you an example. To go from financial services to media and entertainment and digital media is like going from the left brain of running a company to the right brain of running a company. And you don't realize it until you're going through it, that a whole new perspective is being called upon and how you're going to navigate that. And then to go from a high growth startup tech environment to a historic sports organization is no less the same thing, which is, how do you go from operating 150 miles an hour to helping an organization move a lot faster than it used to? And so all of those things kind of build on themselves.
Yeah. When you talked about the transition from that, I kind of flashback from when I left IBM to go to Martha Stewart. IBM, very structured, shirt and tie, the whole bit. And we were going through dress down. Dress down was coming into play, and everybody was trying to figure out. We're sitting around in the meeting trying to figure out, what does dress down look like. I said, take off your tie. So this was dress down, in doing that. And when I went to Martha Stewart, and I'd sit in on some of the design meetings, and I'd see them sitting there for kind of a learning point for me was that they were sitting and looking at pine cones, trying to figure out the perfect pine cone for a photo shoot. And I realized I've got to back up and maybe become a little more creative, in making that process. So we all learn from those. If you could give some advice for people that are just starting out, HRBPs, human resource business partners, for the non-initiated, what advice would you give them if they're interested in, I'm going to say interested in because we had this discussion offline, in growing their careers to a certain level, label, or whatever it would be?
Well, if someone is aspiring to be, let's call it a chief people officer at some point in their career, I'd say one of the single most important learning experiences I had, interestingly enough, since we were talking about Dave Ulrich before we jumped on the conversation here, I remember going to the HR executive program at University of Michigan 25, 30 years ago.
Okay.
And one of the things at that point, so this is kind of relative to this question, was going through the process of recognizing, and I still think about it today in the world that we're operating in, is to look at and take an outside-in view. And that if you want to be effective as a business leader, as certainly an HR leader, is ask yourself, is what I'm doing having the impact that it should be having on the end customer or those that we serve? And I'll use the example of where I am today at the USGA. One of the things that we do is run the US Open, which is the national championship in the sport here in the United States. And we have a couple 100,000 people show up, and we have an entire city that is built around running this week-long event. And so the question is, the experience that a customer is having, a spectator is having, a player is having, a vendor is having, our partners are having, we want them all to be great experiences. So what am I doing as a chief HR officer to affect positive outcomes in all of those areas, looking back in and saying, how are we contributing to make that successful? Or what are we doing to prevent that from being as successful as we want? And so for you to understand how you contribute to that end success and learning about the business so you can connect that back to the work you're performing, I think is an essential thing you need to understand and be conscious of.
I'm saying, wow, because that's so cool. I did a session out of Singapore this morning, and we were talking about the same thing. So when I did this, I said, you always think if you do this, what's happening over here? And this is business outcome. And that's exactly what you just walked through in trying to understand that. Because the difference in that is that, so if you're thinking of human resources, people and the policies and procedures, no, it's the outside in. And this is what Dave talks about, is that outside in approach. What's the customer experience? What is the customer experience, and everyone that's coming to that event for 3-4 days, how can we max that out? And then the people strategy comes from your side. Right. And when I was going through that experience, I was working at Citibank at the time. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, how does that translate to my role, my organization, and how do I put that into play? And that was also one of the things that also makes you realize as part of growing is, who am I working for? What's the readiness of the organization? And can I even apply that kind of thinking, or are they looking at the world that way where maybe it doesn't align with what I need and want, and maybe you've got to consider alternative organizations who maybe are more forward thinking. And in many ways, that's one of the reasons why I left the organization, because I wanted something different. And heading into the world of media, it gave you a different kind of engagement opportunity, which I think was more aligned with the learning that I wanted and was able to pursue. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Old school leadership, new school leadership, COVID, pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID. What do you see as the major learning point from leaders, how leaders are going to have to adjust? I read an article about Brian Chesky, who's the founding CEO for Airbnb, and how he was rethinking the business of what they created, rethinking. So from a C-suite who may be stuck in fixed mindset to a growth mindset, how would you, as an advisor, and I'm moving out from the role that you're playing, CHRO advisor, coaching that leader into how this whole thing is going to change? And the reason I ask that is because the analogy you gave from the tournament, and you've got 4 or 5 days, but you want to max out every portion of that to create the performance of that.
Right. Well, let's build on that for as an example. So I'll answer it in two ways. So if I'm advising an organization, there are a couple of things. First of all, what is the state of your business and your industry, and are the questions that you're asking about this the right questions? Do you need to begin to reframe and reimagine that what success looks like is changing, and how do you go about filling the gaps between what you define as maybe core to your business and how you begin to pivot, and what's the ways to be able to learn and understand what you need to do to venture forth in some new pathways to generate revenue, to maybe redefine what the workplace looks like, maybe how you deploy resources inside the organization begin to shift and change, because you're realizing that, there's an old saying that the future is not an extension of the past, and that you've got to begin to be more open-minded. And so in the world of sports, take it one step further, and I think COVID brings that to light, which is the fan experience for sports is now going to change, because while there's greater ability to fill stadiums slowly but surely, probably a year from now, the reality is how you engage with fans to create a great experience has to also be reimagined. So, I mean, we've gone as far as doing, new versions of both VR and AR to be able to experience our championships in a way that probably would have not been thought of 5 years ago. But we have to be prepared to give people a new way to experience what we're doing. And therefore, from a chief HR officer and advisor point of view, the question is, if that's where you're going to head, what is the organization going to have to do to live up to that new level of expectation? And that is a major skill, capability, culture, digital transformation opportunity that every organization is probably wrestling with right now in some way.
Yeah. Current state, pre, future state, post. What do we need to make that happen? You talk VR, you talk all of that's tied back into the technology piece, the roles that's going to be needed from that, creating the experience from that. So one of the things I've always kind of latched onto, and I study a lot. When I say study a lot, I have a Google alert on the customer experience, and I translate that over to the employee experience. And I said, if we would focus from that HR perspective for the customer experience and use those same kind of metrics or KPIs,
right,
that maybe we could create a better employee experience. Do you kind of agree with that, or am I on point? Or
so much has been talked about employees as customers, and it was at one point a customer experience versus an employee experience, and now we're focused on the holistic employee experience. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do know that through COVID, it's become very clear that how people are treated in the workplace is a real business imperative that is not a soft issue. It is a fundamental premise of running a successful organization. And so employee experience, however an organization defines it, to being very holistically empathetic and inclusive to, the Coinbase. We're not talking about anything related to the social world or activism. This is not who we are. I mean, these are extreme cases, which is, you've got to decide as an organization, what is the employee experience you want to create that's going to meet the business and the strategy you're trying to achieve. And it's got to be right for your organization. It's not, these are the things that all employee experiences should be. It's got to fit with the organization and what it is.
So it's kind of like going to a tailor to get a suit made, and the suit has to be fitted for that individual. And one of the things I find in the Middle East and in Asia, people will always ask us, well, I want to learn the best practices. And I said, don't say that.
Yeah.
Because that worked over there. They're funded more than you would ever be funded for those people activities. Why don't you, it's always good to anchor, but how do you build, understand, diagnose your organization, and then you build from there as a solution?
Exactly. What are our practices?
Yeah.
What do we think we can, flex and experiment and design that could be really exciting and interesting. And when we commit to things that are new, and we can learn from other companies by virtue of what
Yeah.
they're doing,
Yeah.
but you're not going to just take what they're doing and plug it in. But there's always ways to learn from others. And I think, of course, that's part of how we learn as adults. But honestly, even in the new world of now operating in the quote unquote hybrid environment, whatever that turns out to be, we're all kind of learning together. There is no playbook. We all know that we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to be better for it. And to say that you can benchmark what someone else is doing, I think is a dangerous business, because it may have nothing to do with really the way your organization looks at the same issue.
Yeah. So let's talk about so we've gone through your career and you've touched on so many different industries. When did you feel that now I'm being listened to? I mean, can you kind of point to a point that
Wow.
in that process that said, okay, now I'm being asked for advice?
That's a really good question. I would say that when I became the HR lead for a business unit at Citibank, and suddenly it was incumbent upon me to be an influencer at the table, I suddenly realized that, in the kind of the classic HR business partner need that, I need to be at the table. I should be at the table. And suddenly I actually am at the table. You begin to realize that you've got to be able to bring to the conversation thinking and context and perspective and solutions and business understanding that now it's resting in your hands. And suddenly when people are listening to you, I think what really truly begins to go to the next level is when you've had experiences and successes, even if they're small wins or wins that affect many people, that people begin to look at you and say, wow, he can or she can really get things done. Why don't we invite this person into the conversation and get their point of view? And it's not based upon you selling yourself. It's based specifically on your ability to show that you can influence and lead with and through others. And I can think of moments across the continuum, but even early in my career, Ron, where I put an idea out on the table at Citibank early in my career, and it was kind of the classic, here's a great idea, I'll throw it out there. And my boss said, Steve, I really like that idea. I want you to run with it. I had no idea what I was talking about. All I knew was I had to run with it. And it was running what turned out to be a series of regional conferences, the first one being in Antwerp in Belgium. But I knew this. I knew that I had to deliver. And when you deliver results and you do it well by working well with others, those are the experiences that build the credibility that get you to the next level.
So, I always tease people, when they talk about this so-called, and I hate the phrase seat at the table. I said, you know what? You have to deliver. If you've got that seat at the table, you have to deliver. Because if you're just sitting there as an ornament, there's no value you're bringing to that. What value do you bring to that meeting of all of these so-called department heads or whatever it may be, whatever the makeup of that room is, that table is? What value can you bring? What insights can you bring?
But the other side of that too is, while there are points in your career where you think you should be or you want to be, it's also, do you have someone or are there people who are your allies or supporters who say, inviting you into the process and saying, I want you to learn, I want you to observe, I want you to understand what it means to contribute at the next level. I feel lucky where I had a couple of those opportunities at key points in my career, so that at least I felt more confident that being in the situation, at least I had experienced it enough to understand maybe what not to do as much as what to do.
Mm-hmm. So that takes us to another discussion of that mentor inside of an organization and trying to find that, and the importance of identifying that person and having that person kind of shepherd you through.
So, I had a boss who came from a completely different industry and ended up in HR. And so this was a classic case of a true business leader who landed in an HR leadership role. He and I were completely different. And he was an amazing mentor. And one of the reasons why he was an amazing mentor is because he had the patience to listen. Mm-hmm. He spent the time helping me craft things that I needed to get done. He challenged me constantly. And then probably one of the most important things he ever did for me was he actually took me out of my job and he put me into a special assignment. And this was not a special assignment that was suddenly a higher level assignment. It was a lateral assignment as part of a global project. And what that did was force me out of my comfort zone in a way that I will tell you that I took it as an insult and as a step back. But in reality, what he was doing was setting me up for a step change beyond that experience. But he was kind of the classic person who had kind of the velvet hammer kind of touch. But at the end of the day, he was a great mentor. I think about another mentor that I had when I was working at Time Inc., who was also an outstanding leader, but really in particular, an incredible advocate for what I was contributing in ways that I was least expecting it in a public setting. And so, giving that level of confidence was also really, positive. And so for me, I want to return that to the people that I've led over the last 25 years. And so I really have paid it forward as a result.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that. And one of the things I look at is that how many people do you still hear from that you've mentored over the years? So when I was in hiring mode inside of an organization, that was one of the questions I would ask, is that your last job, how many people do you still stay in contact with? And they may answer, say, well, I don't really keep in touch. We kind of all disperse. I said, okay, fine. I give you one. And I go back to the other. So previous job, when's the last time? What was the general conversation about? If they give me another kind of, I don't connect with anybody, I don't really want that person to work with me because I want people to build relationships. Years pass and you're still referring back to 2 or 3 people. I can refer back to 2 or 3 people. I try and pay that forward, that people that I worked back last week, and this is kind of off the conversation. I talked to someone I worked with in the optical business. Was probably my second job into working. And we had not talked to each other, and I'm going to say possibly 15 years. And we had the greatest conversation. And another one came up from that same era within a week, and we've got a call set up. So I think that's important. So give me some insights on that.
Yeah, look, I think we have responsibilities as leaders to make an impact in people's lives. And, I would say to anybody who's watching this, even this relationship here that Ron and I have, and the importance of having a relationship or two that can be meaningful to you in your professional life is really important. And Ron, to your story, I was at the gym a few years ago, and I ran into someone who was hired by me in a rotational development program 30 years ago.
Wow.
Who is now an adult with 2 high school age children. Yeah. And he introduced me to his son, who was also at the gym, and he said, this is Steve Schloss. Steve, I want you to know the way you had an impact on me. And he began to describe it in front of his son. And I didn't know what to say. All I know is, wow, whatever I did back then, I made an impact in this person. And so it makes you realize how relationships and commitment to help people and to pay it forward and to say, yes, I'm happy to have a conversation with you when a person wants to get your input is something you should do and not shy away from, because
Yeah.
it's just a cycle that will pay itself forward in some way in the future.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that story, I love that because every day we should try and enhance someone, from past work experiences. And it just goes on and on. So, how did you get that confidence level first time around? And now you're sitting in a C suite meeting, and now you're sitting in a board meeting. And how did you make that transition, feeling that comfort zone to say, you know what, I earned a spot to be here, and I can say,
Right.
provide insight.
Right. I think it both comes with experience and time. I can't deny that. I was a shyer person growing up, and you learn how to become a different version of yourself as you get older, and you learn how to adapt and respond to the changes around you. But I think the confidence ultimately comes from, I think the most important thing of all is accepting and going after new opportunities and knowing when you're going into it that you might not know as much as you need to, but that you feel confident that you can do what you have to do to achieve the outcome that is being put upon you or that you want to go after. And that comes from relationships, from skills and perspective. It comes from knowing how to tap into certain resources externally. It just comes from being able to frame and strategically think into the future, and you build confidence in your ability to do those things. And I will say, to that point, I'm a huge reader, and as you are, someone who is constantly staying in touch with the world around us. And it's not just about business.
Yeah.
It's bigger than that, whether it's politics or economics or the environment, to just the dynamics of technology. There are so many things going on that the more you can bring all of those things together and tie them into the kinds of influence conversations you can have, you become more confident because people begin to realize that there's a lot for that this person can offer. I want to hear more. I want to listen to this person more. And I think others should do the same.
So that thought leader, whoa, that's the brand that comes about. I'm the thought leader in talking through that. But that's how it's built. And I tell people that you have to read everything you possibly can. You have to become a student of your industry. You have to become a student of your company and what's going on outside. With people, specifically human resource, we tend to be focused downward. But when you come up for air, you've got to understand the whole context of what we're doing. And that's the same thing that you're talking about, talking about now. Yeah.
Completely. And it's effort. It's not something you can be passive about. And, but I get a lot of enjoyment. And by the way, you can get a lot of context from talking to the business owner in your community. It's not just what's happening in HR. I mean, there's so many things you can learn from. You just have to be willing to see those as opportunities for learning, and ideas get spurred from all these conversations.
Mm-hmm. So I'm doing a project now here in Dubai for a major kind of cool grocery chain. I learned so much in that session, in those sessions, from an industry I've never been a part of. Waste, the team environment inside of a so-called grocery store. And you look at I told him at the end of one of the sessions, I said, I learned more about your business. It was a learning experience for me. So based on what you said, you learn more from people that are doing other things. And that provides the context when you go out and whether it's advisory or whether it's that role of the CHRO. So post-COVID, apparently you're there because I've seen your Instagrams and Facebooks that you're out at all these courses all across the globe and all these kinds of things. And I'm like, well, gotta be a cool job. So what advice would you give CEOs that are listening in as to how do we approach post-COVID? And your situation is different because you have these events. You leave one event, you go to another event. So you're learning from each one
Mm-hmm.
And what can we do better?
You know, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is clarity is really important. You have to learn to be clear in your message and in the why you're doing something, and in helping people build ownership. You have to learn. You have to. To me, the most powerful people that are currently going to be in the center of the conversation, that as a leader you need to be care of, are, let's define them as middle managers. You know, at some point, you know, everyone is saying we need to get rid of the middle management layer, and everyone, it should be fully flat.
Yeah.
But the reality is, managers of teams and teams themselves, as you just described in what you're doing with your client, leading teams in the environment that we're in right now, learning how to be a facilitator, a person who nurtures culture and capability, and suddenly taking on greater accountability of the performance of the team in a remote or hybrid environment, is putting a real light on the role of a team leader, a manager of an operation, in a way that will probably place even more in the center for the business of growth and development what management and leadership actually looks like in the future. It's not just tactical learning how to give feedback and being a good supervisor and delegating. It's just becoming more complex, and giving people the tools to be able to do that well, as we're operating in just such a dynamically changing environment, is really in some ways the center for a lot of organizations to spend their greatest part of their investment in development of people, quite honestly. And that includes also how the work is designed and how the organization is designed, and what is the role of a manager in helping shape that on a team by team basis.
Okay. I'm doing some work for a board out of Singapore, the board. And my thought is, or my topic is, kind of reimagining everything. So you think from fixed to growth mindset, and how to, you know, make that shift. Do you think that from being in all the industries you've worked in, and different type leaders, different DNAs of organization, are you seeing kind of a common theme from the fixed to growth, if it's an older kind of organization versus a newer? And I say that because you're working with a lot of startups, you know, you're advisor to venture capitalists. A little different, because that venture capitalist, new organization starting up in a garage, apartment, or whatever it is, and they're trying everything, and they feel comfortable in that space. Can you give us some insights from that side, from the fixed to growth?
Well, look, you know, everyone is trying to navigate growth, and it comes down to the rate and the pace and the complexity of what they're trying to solve for, or the market they're trying to create or respond to. If you're leading a high growth organization right now, you're really concerned that you have a really highly motivated workforce, and that people are excited about the journey that you're leading them through, and that you have the right people on your leadership team. And in many cases, what you see in startup environments, and I experienced this well before I was doing what I'm doing right now, whether it's at the USGA or working as an advisor, is that oftentimes the smartest people who are building companies are also the worst leaders. And so it doesn't mean people won't follow them, but they're just not wired to lead. They're wired to look to the future. They're wired to create. But that alone is not what leadership is. And so helping fill that gap, or surrounding yourself with the right people, that's leadership, and being consistent in the way you run a business going forward. That transcends a 125-year-old sports organization to a 2-year-old, 30-person startup company.
Okay. I think you kind of nail that. I mean, you nail that to the wall, as a result of it. So talk to us a little bit about Listen Forward, as much as you can share with us.
Sure.
Principle of Listen Forward.
Sure. So Listen Forward LLC is an executive coaching and team coaching practice that I started a year ago. Frankly, I started it right in the middle of COVID. Mm-hmm. And I started it because after, frankly, doing a lot of pro bono work for people who know me from years of experience or from places that people have asked my opinion, I decided, you know what, it's time to turn that into a formal opportunity to run a real business and practice. And so this is really extending what I've done already, but the chance to help teams in particular, help leadership teams of all types be more effective over time, I think is a fun and exciting opportunity. Yeah. I do that already, but to do that with other organizations on the side is something that I love doing. And so it's a passion of mine. And so, if a person went to the site, listenforwardllc.com, there's a story as to even how I got here in the first place. And it authentically describes who I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so that's a little about what it is. And the work that I'm doing with the venture capital firm is another example of just extending and bringing my experience to a different audience as well.
Yeah. Well, I had that discussion today concerning M&A, how it's changed, mergers and acquisition for the non-initiated people. Mergers and acquisition, how at one time all the companies focused on was the financial side. And there was a lot of kickback from that because once they took ownership, they realized that the people side was screwed up. And now people like yourselves are going in and doing that analysis based on what are the people numbers, engagement numbers, learning and development, all these kinds of things. And we match those two and we make a decision, a business decision based on that.
Yeah. And for me, also just coming from the tech industry to sports, that was also just in and of itself an amazing learning experience around your perceptions about how an industry is run and whether it's sophisticated or not comes up against the reality that, wow, it's not what you thought it was. And there's a real ripe opportunity to help it change. And so in many ways, bringing fresh thinking to different environments is something that gets me, excited and jazzed up and being able to help and make a difference. So.
Okay, cool. Steve, thank you for this time that we spent together. Great conversation. If there was a piece of advice you could give to aspiring CHROs or CHROs in residence now, residence as being inside of an organization, what would you give them as a takeaway?
I would say that learning is your number one job, and that as you're trying to pursue your own career and kind of present yourself in a certain way, is that don't take yourself too seriously. That things change rapidly, and sometimes you just have to go with it and have fun and experience the things that you're going through and enjoy it, because there are lots of things we can do to make a difference. And find those spaces where you think you can make the greatest difference and jump into it with both feet. But look at yourself in the mirror and realize that there are so many things you can do, you can offer people. Just don't take yourself too seriously, because there are just greater issues surrounding you, and you can be a big help to others. But it's others that you should focus on, not yourself.
Yeah, my daughter gave me that feedback. She said, don't take yourself too seriously. It's not all that. I said, okay, cool.
Exactly. It's true.
Steve, thank you so much. I need you to hold on for a minute as we close out, but this has been absolutely great.
Thank you. And I appreciate anybody who is watching, and love to connect with you on LinkedIn if you want as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right.